Daryl and Stan would spar. They became friends and started hanging out.
They were two young men who found their purpose inside the ring.
Daryl was very competitive, but Stan was way beyond better than him.
Stan was tough, he could fight, he had no quit in him.
They call him the Iron Man for a reason.
But when one friend becomes consumed with jealousy,
He was getting beat by Stan, didn't like it, and his ego just couldn't handle that.
a healthy competition spirals into obsession.
Envy, that's on a different level, and it's extremely unhealthy, extremely selfish.
And a bitter rivalry forms.
His ultimate goal was stardom. And he saw Stan as the very thing that's in his way.
When you think that you can beat Stan, you got something coming for you.
It wasn't competition.
That rage had been building for years. He didn't want to be beside Stan. He wanted to be Stan.
Stan is my friend, sparring partner, trained together, same culture, Haitian descent, so we speak the same language. Only thing I can say about Stan, he's a good person, good heart, work hard, never gave up. Just that smile in his face. You know, you hang out with Stan, you're gonna have a good time with no problems.
Did Stan ever mention, okay, this guy has issues with me, I don't know how to handle it anymore? Did he ever say anything to you?
If Stan would have told me, it'd have been a different story.
Stan Stanislas' story begins in 1992. Born to Haitian immigrant parents, Stan grows up with his 3 younger siblings in Boynton Beach, Florida, before moving to West Palm Beach when he is a teenager. Stan is a kind and ambitious young man and finds his true calling at just 16 years old.
I remember it was early September 2008. And boxing was big time down here. Stan came to my gym to learn some skills. He was in high school at the time and had been picked on by some guys at school that boxed at another local gym, so Stan took a few classes that week.
When Stan came in the gym, I saw him, I said, oh, okay. And when I found he was Haitian, it's Haitian descent, I said, oh, wow, that's my brother. I said, hey, I'm gonna teach you all the tricks, all the trade, you know what I'm saying? So we started training together, hitting the bag.
And everyone in my gym was saying, this guy's getting good, he's getting good, he's got some talent. And they were right. He was just an athlete. He could wrestle, he could kickbox.
He learned so quick, so quick. I can tell you we had gym wars, me and him. Gym wars. Oh man, there were times how I'll beat him up, the next day he'll beat me up. Like, iron sharpen iron. I'm gonna get you next time. But I said, let me wait this heel first.
By Stan's senior year of high school, his name is recognized as one of the best young boxers in West Palm Beach.
Stan started competing. Well, I think his first fight was in August of 2009, won by knockout.
His nickname was the Iron Man. That was his nickname.
His timing was on point. He was always in shape. He had a good body shot, good body punches. Very well-rounded.
He did a lot of accomplishment in about 2 or 3 years, just training, busting his butt.
Stanley was very close to his family, a good, tight-knit group. His parents are good people, and his parents always came to support him at the shows we put on, the fights.
Following high school, Stan's boxing career really takes off, and his generous nature is evident when he begins taking on a role as trainer to other young boxers, including 20-year-old Daryl Talismay.
Daryl's family migrated to America, and his father actually came from Haiti. He is the first generation of the immigrants being here. And so Daryl has somewhat a similar story to Stan.
Frankie was talking about a guy he met at the barber shop, was talking about boxing, another gym, and we should spar. So Frank said, okay, come to Dave Luter's gym, we'll spar at Dave Luter's gym. Stanley sparred him first and knocked him down 5 times in 2 rounds. I had to stop it, so it was bad. But he would come back every couple of weeks, every few weeks and spar again.
Stan and Daryl become fast friends and motivate one another in and outside of the ring.
Stan, good person, good heart. If you had something you know about boxing, Stan would teach you, you know? He would never try to put you down. He would always motivate you.
The Golden Gloves is a very well-known tournament for the amateur level guys. He won the Golden Gloves here as an open fighter. Open fighter means you have more than 10 fights.
He wanted to go to Olympics, but it didn't work for him. And I told Stan, take it easy. And, man, he wanted to be somebody. You know, he wanted to be somebody.
When it didn't necessarily work out with being able to compete in the Olympics, he decided, I'm going to see what else I can do beyond this sport. And so Stan actually went back to school.
In the spring of 2015, the 22-year-old is excited to move into his own apartment.
Stan had an apartment with a guy named Dexter, who's one of his best friends.
Stan was my neighbor in Palm Beach Shores. We lived right across the street from the beach. He was always helpful and sweet and quiet. Also, he was a computer wizard. I was having a problem with our computer, and he was like, I can help you with that.
He did IT. He used to fix computers. That was his job. Stan was a regular person, working, you know what I'm saying? Just trying to prepare for the future, trying to have a good life.
You think someone was obsessed with Stan?
Yes. But I didn't know that. He was fearing for his life like that.
(911) emergency. This is the SO with a transfer. Somebody got shot in the head.
So it's Thanksgiving morning, 2015, and Palm Beach Shores Police Department, they receive an emergency call from a woman named Cheyenne.
Cheyenne relays to dispatchers that her neighbor, Dexter Dunbar, just came to her apartment, pleading for help.
And he says his roommate, Stan, has been shot.
Dexter, Cheyenne, and her boyfriend Brandon immediately ran back to Dexter and Stan's apartment.
They actually see Stan kind of in the doorway and he's on his back. So Cheyenne calls the police.
Just stay with me, ma'am. Okay, and where is the person with the weapon? Any idea? He said they had left.
When Palm Beach Shores police arrive at the scene, they find Stan laid out on his back, and he's deceased.
We open the front door, and there's cops, and there's police tape. And the first thing I remember is seeing Stan's feet at his doorstep. And I was like, what happened? I didn't know. I was shocked about it.
Stan's roommate, Dexter, was there, and he was able to hear and see before Stan was shot.
He said, Daryl is the shooter. I was shocked. What could lead up to something like this?
early in the morning on Thanksgiving 2015. Palm Beach Shores police have been called to the home of Stan Stanislas, where the 23-year-old boxer has suffered a gunshot wound to the head, allegedly at the hands of Daryl Talismay.
They find Stan laid out on his back, and he's deceased. Police find the shell casing, which was a .45. Stan's roommate, Dexter, continues to talk with police. He tells them, that he's just as in shock as everyone else. He continues to tell police that the events that occurred a few hours before.
Daryl texts me because we always go out together on Wednesdays. So then, I say 10 minutes later, he calls Stan. So Stan's like, "Oh yeah, we're gonna pick up Daryl."
It's the night before a holiday. You're celebrating. You're trying to unwind.
Daryl was drinking, smoking weed, and kept on stepping up to Stanley to try to challenge him to a fight. And Stanley wasn't drinking, wasn't smoking weed, was totally sober, just hanging out, wouldn't fight.
But Daryl can't let it go. There's the typical banter that starts to happen, but it gets a little bit heated.
He had ill feelings about never being able to beat Stan in the ring. Stan kept on saying, "No, we've done this, we've been there. No, I don't even want to box anymore. I'm getting out of the whole business. Let's leave it lie." But he basically begged Stan to give him another shot. And then finally, Stan finally agreed, "Fine, one more shot."
They're out in the alley, and Daryl takes a couple swings at Stan.
So they square off again. Stan basically was getting the best of him.
He was just at a much higher level. It wasn't competition.
And so Daryl has to get up off of the ground. But the night continues. They decide to visit another bar. And they're at a rooftop bar, but there's still some disrespectful banter. He's being a sore loser at this point. And with that continuing to happen, they go their separate ways.
About what time did you guys get home?
It could have been I don't know, probably could be around 4:30. Right when we get in the house, 4 minutes later, it's knock on the door. I look through the window and I see it's Daryl. So Daryl's like, "Tell Stan to come here. Just squash. Tell him, tell him come here." I'm like, "Man, Stan, he said come here and squash. It's over." So Stan goes to the window. He was like, "Pull your shirt up."
Stan kind of felt something because he asked, "Let me see your waist." Usually when someone's asking to see someone's waist, they're looking to make sure that there's no gun.
Next thing you know, Stan opens the door. I didn't know he opened the door until I turned around and hit, "Pow!" Stan falls on the floor. So I see Daryl run. So I run to the bathroom, jump out the window, hop the fence, run to Brandon's house and got Brandon. So by the time we got here, Stan was already gone.
As Dexter continues to talk with police, he tells them, that He's just as in shock as everyone else because he kind of thought Daryl was all talk with the long-standing friendship and the ups and downs. It was very, very confusing as to how Daryl actually got to the point of pulling the trigger.
When they argue and stuff, I'm looking at it like, you know, y'all kind of like brothers. And Stan would always tell me, yeah, we know each other for a long time. You know, we just be playing, but you didn't know that it was personal.
Following Dexter's statement, police turned to Stan's neighbor, Brandon DeRosier, and learned more about a growing feud between the two boxers.
Stan often denied Daryl an official fight because Stan was very aware of his ability, and it was a way of him saying indirectly, you need extra work, buddy. You need to go ahead and become more disciplined because this won't be a fair fight.
They always was going through it. We never thought they got this serious, you know what I mean? But like whenever they go through anything, I'm always the person in the middle to break it up.
Daryl was very competitive, but Stan was way beyond better than him. So you can imagine the mismatch.
He was getting beat by Stan, didn't like it, and his ego just couldn't handle that. Stanley, I don't know, he didn't seem to have something to prove. Daryl did.
You know, we all boxers, so you know, since I was, going through that, if y'all gonna do anything, let's go to the ring.
Still, Stan had refused to fight Daryl. That's when Brandon reveals Stan had recently made an ominous request.
Earlier this week, I got a message from Stan that him and Daryl had gotten into a physical altercation. I'm a concealed carrier, and he know that, so he called me begging for one of my guns. Like, bro, I need a gun. Daryl just threatened me, talking about he finna come over here and kill me.
Palm Beach detectives are speaking with Brandon DeRosier, who says his neighbor, Stan Stanislas, had begun to express fears of his friend, Daryl Talismay, just days before Stan was shot to death at his apartment.
He has Brandon for a gun. Where can I find a gun at? He was fearing for his life. Like, this guy trying to kill me.
Stan wasn't a violent person. Even though he was very good at the sports of, boxing, he was a very gentle person. And Brandon, taking everything at face value, Stan, you're not that kind of guy. I'm not gonna even allow you to stoop to that level.
Now Brandon believes that Daryl had made good on his alleged threats and tells detectives that he contacted him just moments after the shooting.
So immediately I'm calling Daryl. I'm blowing him up on Facebook, and he finally answered like, man, my bad, and I didn't mean to do that.
Daryl is crying, and he kept repeating, I didn't mean to, I didn't mean to. So there's some level of shock for Daryl. There's some level of remorse, but we still don't know exactly why.
When police question Brandon's girlfriend, Cheyenne, she offers more insight into Daryl's motive.
What's it been over?
Boxing. It stands 9-0. Daryl felt that he needed to beat him to get his name up. To get his name out, Daryl had to beat Stan.
She lets police know that feud between Daryl and Stan had been going on for quite a bit of time. And it just escalated with Daryl being so fixated on being better than Stan.
Stan was talented, so he got the attention that Daryl was looking for. So I think Daryl was just jealous of that.
When detectives attempt to make contact with Daryl, their calls go unanswered. Police immediately issue an APB for him, while detectives learn more about his background.
There were some run-ins with police as he was growing up. There was one time when Daryl was 18 in 2009 that his sister had to call the police because she found Daryl choking his brother because of some leftovers from the refrigerator.
Police had arrested Daryl for felony assault, but the charges were later dropped.
Because he agreed to stay away from his brother, he wasn't charged with the felony. So Daryl was still trying to kind of figure out his landing in life. He got a job at Home Depot, and he actually met up with a female boxer, and they had a child together. But then in September of 2015, he was found outside of a boxing gym loitering. When police officers see him, they ask him typical questions. What's happening? What are you doing? And instead of him cooperating, he's ready to fight. Police have to threaten to tase him. He kind of calms down and he says, I'm upset. The mother of my child, my girlfriend, she left me.
Daryl was arrested for loitering and resisting arrest, but the charges were ultimately dropped.
Sometimes when you don't have certain consequences for behaviors like that, you don't understand the depth of what you've done. When aggression goes unchecked, you can become unhinged. With police finding out he does have an aggressive history, it's definitely urgent for them to find Daryl.
All right, I'm swinging it around.
At approximately 8 a.m., just a few hours after Stan was killed, police descend on the registered address of Daryl Talismay.
They find Daryl's grandmother, mother, and his infant child sitting outside the house. As they approach, Daryl's mother, she's pretty sure and very reassuring to the police officers that Daryl will come out willingly. So while police are trying to make sure that everyone is safe, they evacuate neighboring houses. They need to make sure that everyone is safe in the area and that there aren't any unnecessary casualties. Well, Daryl's mother agrees to stay with the police while they attempt to apprehend him. The grandmother takes the infant inside the home where Daryl is supposedly located.
Yeah, I tried flagging them over, but she didn't understand and went back into the house. She's an older lady and then the infant.
They go on the loudspeaker and they instruct Daryl to exit the home.
Daryl Talismay, this is the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. I need you to step out of your residence with your hands visible and empty.
Too much time goes by that makes the officers now very cautious. What's happening? Why is it taking him so long?
Daryl Talismay, this is the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. I need you to step out of the front of the residence with your hands visible. I need you to do it now.
You have an older woman and a younger child inside, and so they are the easier targets to be used as hostages. And so officers are on guard now. Everyone is trying to figure out what is going to happen next.
Up 14. Because of what occurred, we're close enough now. We're going to vacate.
Hours after the murder of 23-year-old Stan Stanislas, Palm Beach police are urging suspected killer Daryl Talismay to exit his home.
Just so you know, he's got the child in the window.
Daryl Toulouse, this is the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. I need you to step out of the front of the residence with your hands visible. I need you to do it now.
Finally, Daryl exits with his hands high up in the sky, and he is showing no kind of resistance. Shortly after Daryl exits the home, grandmother and infant child come out of the home, and they're safe. So conflict avoided.
Daryl is handcuffed and placed into the back of the squad car.
They notice that there's a laceration on his lip and his tooth is chipped, and he also has some bandages around his hands. And he is given some medical attention.
Officers immediately transport Daryl Toulouse to the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. There, he is escorted to an interview room where detectives begin their line of questioning and learn more about the 24-year-old.
All right, my man. First, I'm going to introduce myself, Detective Bryant. Is it Mr. Toulouse? Did I say it correctly?
Toulouse.
Toulouse. Okay, cool.
I'd known Daryl since he was a kid. His mom used to bring him to the barbershop for me to cut his hair. He was always been very quiet to me. It was one day that I got to the gym and I saw him. I said, "Hey, Daryl, what's up?" I said, "I see you're taking up boxing." I was very excited to see him doing that. You know, because I love the sport. I have a great love for the sport. He said that he would want to further his career, that, you know, was something that he would look forward to doing. As far as talent-wise, it would have to be something that he would have to really, really work hard. He looked the part, he had the size, he looked like he had the ability, but when he punched, you know, he needed work. Stan is a different story. Stan was very patient. Stan picked up quick, he learned fast.
How long have you guys boxed together, spar?
Yeah.
How long have you guys been doing that?
As long as I've been boxing, for about 4 years.
Daryl and Stan would spar, but it wouldn't go good for Daryl. In a way, they became friends and started hanging out.
They're young men and they're exploring life, and so they hang out, they go to different social gatherings and scenery.
Let's start from the beginning. What was the issue with you and Stan this morning at the club?
We went to the club. I had a couple of drinks. We got into a fight. After the club, we got into a fight. I was drunk still. And all I remember is of me and him getting into a fight. And like I said,
what did he say? What upset you? I mean, I understand, you know, people, you get into arguments, you have, you know, issues, that kind of thing, that happens. But what did he say to?
I really don't remember. It's what led to us having a fist fight.
Mm-hmm. Is that why your lips? Is that from that?
Yeah, he hit me in my mouth. He hit me in my head. He's a professional fighter. He can fight.
Mm-hmm.
He does wrestling. He does a lot of mixed martial arts,
like MMA and stuff like that.
So he can fight. You know, all I know how to do is box. I felt that I needed to protect myself. The only way, you know, for me to protect myself was the shooting. I felt like I had to defend myself.
That is the craziest thing. Daryl went to Stan's house. Daryl said, "Stan, come outside and squash the beef." Self-defense? How's that self-defense? What did Stan do?
How'd you get over to his house, though, in the apartment?
To be honest, I don't even remember. It was all a blur to me.
I know it's some stuff's a blur, but your story doesn't, part of it ain't making sense.
I'm gonna tell you guys the truth. If I remember every single part of that story, I would tell you guys. You know what I'm saying? There's nothing for me to hide.
I'm not saying you're trying to hide something, but, you know, it appears that way, and that's all. I'm just trying to understand it.
Despite Daryl's confession that he shot Stan, detectives are skeptical about his claims of self-defense. While Daryl is booked into the county jail, authorities begin building their case to discredit him.
I was very surprised that he was self-defense. This is premeditated. You don't go to somebody's house and shoot somebody in the head, all right? You don't do that.
They need to find everything that ties Daryl to the allegations.
Palm Beach police have arrested 24-year-old Daryl Talismay for the murder of 23-year-old Stan Stanislas. While Daryl is held in custody, detectives secure a search warrant for his house.
They find the weapon underneath the bed in a box. It matches the shell casing that was at the scene. It's a clear match that this was the weapon that was used to take Stan's life.
With Daryl Talismay claiming self-defense, detectives continue interviewing friends and family of both Daryl and Stan.
He didn't strike me as a person like that. You know, there had to be something that, to my opinion, that pushed him to do something like that, to be like that. I've known Daryl to just be a quiet person, not an aggressive individual, as far as what he portrays to me.
But Stan's friends paint a different picture of Daryl's feelings towards Stan.
Daryl was obsessed with Stan because probably thoughts in his head, I'm better than Stan. I'm gonna whoop his butt. No, Stan is very good. This is a Golden Glove champion, 8 professional fights. They call him the Iron Man for a reason.
So as far as Daryl's boxing style, there really wasn't one. It was just throw punches, block punches, fight. There was no strategy, there was no technique, no method.
And when you think that you can beat Stan, you got something coming for you. And I can imagine sparring. It was bad for Daryl. And Daryl probably took it to heart.
This fella never won a fight. And that's why Stan didn't want to fight him again. That's how much of a stand-up guy he was.
Daryl, his ultimate goal was stardom. And he went to the extreme of having a star tattooed on his cheek. So it's a daily reminder of, I have to be a star. I need to be a star. And with him not fulfilling that, Daryl put a lot of emphasis on Stan and his career and his success levels of achievement because Daryl saw Stan as the very thing that's in his way.
Daryl is formally charged with first-degree murder. More than a year and a half after Stan's murder, Daryl Talismay goes to trial on his 26th birthday. Prosecutors assert that Daryl's growing fixation with Stan's success had imploded the night before Thanksgiving.
Daryl wanted to fight with knuckles with him on the street, and Stan body slammed him. But Stan said, "You will never beat me. Why would he spar me?" And that's what set him off. And his thoughts in his head, you know what? I'm gonna find something that's gonna beat you.
When it comes time for the defense to take the floor, Daryl Talismay is ready to throw a few jabs of his own.
Daryl takes the stand. He changes his story a little bit, and Daryl is now getting deeper in the self-defense narrative that he's trying to tell. He says he goes to Stan's apartment because he just wants to collect his items.
He trying to say, oh, I wanted to pick my PlayStation, Stan hit me.
That's when Daryl says, out of self-defense, he shoots Stan. And because he says, you know, I know Stan can beat me. He's stronger than me. He feels like Stan was a weapon, if you will.
I remember being at the trial and watching the defending attorney badmouth Stan, saying Stan was a bully, and Daryl was acting in self-defense, and I was just squirming my chair, wanted to scream out.
He never in his life came to me like that. He was just so nice, so humble. No way, that's a lie.
As the case goes to the jury, Stan's loved ones grapple with the possibility that Daryl may walk free. Jurors in Palm Beach County, Florida, are deliberating the fate of 26-year-old Daryl Talismay.
He was really trying to paint a picture of Stan as being the aggressor because he had the techniques that he had, and he was a professional champion fighter with the martial arts blended in his techniques. However, Daryl wasn't painting that kind of picture of Stan. He was actually painting the picture of, I'm sulking, I don't like it, I actually hate it because it reminds me that I don't have this, I couldn't have it because he was in the way of it.
And I watched the prosecuting attorney with the closing arguments slam the door on every argument. It's beautiful, watching a masterpiece being painted.
The jury deliberated only a few hours and still found Daryl guilty of murder. And so he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
I was not surprised by that verdict. Very happy about that verdict. And I do think about Daryl. I wonder about how Daryl's doing in prison. How is it for him waking up every day knowing that he's gonna be in jail for the rest of his life for what he did? I think Daryl was very envious of Stan's success, his personality, his demeanor, his skills, the attention he was getting. I think Daryl was very jealous of that and just couldn't live with the fact that he wasn't getting it and Stan was.
Stan was like undefeated. You know, if you look at the measurement, Stan gonna always win no matter what. If Stan was still alive and Daryl spotted him again, guess what's gonna happen? Stan gonna whoop his butt. Point blank.
I believe Stan's benefit of the doubt is kind of what got him caught in this situation. He had so much benefit of the doubt, even though the flags and the signs were there and they were blaring.
I wish that he called me and said, hey, Frank, I have a problem with Daryl. Can you please talk to him? Sure. What kind of problem? I fear for my life. I said, oh, I would take it very seriously.
I was shocked. I was flabbergasted. Why did this happen? I thought Stanley had already thrown the towel in and was done with that part of his life. But somebody didn't want that to be. It's a waste. What a waste to take that approach to hurt his mother and father like that.
I'm still in shock. Yeah, I still just can't believe this happened. And it Stan's not with us anymore. I think about his parents on a regular basis, how much a part of their life he was. Him and his dad were very close.
Which ways have you been able to keep Stan's memory alive?
You know, I have his gloves for a reason. Having these gloves, you know, just keeps me going. It pushes me. You know what I'm saying? Life's never over. There are times you're gonna be down. You know, you could look, I can refer to that. Man, what's Stan would have done? He would have pushed right through. If Stan would stay here, where would he be at? Probably a big-time professional boxer, who knows? He's always in my thoughts in my head, always.
The world lost a great human being, just a great soul.
There are mornings that disappear into history without leaving a trace. Then there are mornings that freeze in time, replayed endlessly in the minds of investigators, neighbors, and grieving families who never stop asking the same question. What happened behind that apartment door? What transformed an ordinary day into one of Pennsylvania's most haunting crime scenes? Before DNA databases, before genetic genealogy, before technology could reach into the past and pull forgotten secrets back into the light, there was only silence. A silence so complete that it swallowed nearly 3 decades of hope. The case began with a young woman whose future seemed as bright as the children she inspired every day. Christy Myrick was 25 years old, energetic, compassionate, and devoted to teaching. She had recently moved to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, building a new life hundreds of miles from her hometown. Friends described her as warm, ambitious, and endlessly optimistic. She loved her students. She loved her family. She believed hard work would carry her toward the life she dreamed of creating. Nothing about her routine suggested danger. Nothing hinted that someone was watching. Nothing warned that the next sunrise would become the final chapter of her life. December 21st, 1992, the last Monday before Christmas. The streets were wrapped in the quiet rhythm of the holiday season. Children counted the days until presents appeared beneath glowing trees. Schools prepared for winter break. Families rushed through final errands. It should have been another ordinary winter morning. Instead, it became the beginning of one of Lancaster County's most infamous cold cases. Christy lived alone inside a modest apartment in East Lampeter Township, just outside the city of Lancaster. Her apartment reflected the life of a young professional still settling into adulthood. Lesson plans rested beside books. Everyday belongings waited exactly where she had left them the night before. Nothing inside suggested panic. Nothing suggested she expected company. Yet sometime during the early morning hours, everything changed. As daylight spread across the neighborhood, Christy failed to arrive at work. At first, the delay didn't immediately trigger alarm. Traffic happened. Winter weather slowed commuters. Unexpected mornings occasionally interrupted even the most reliable routines. But minutes became longer than anyone felt comfortable ignoring. Her absence was unusual. Very unusual. She was known for punctuality. Her students expected her. Fellow teachers noticed almost immediately that something was wrong. Attempts to reach her brought no answer. Concern turned into urgency. Someone decided to check on her. When people approached her apartment, there were no obvious signs of chaos from outside. No shattered windows. No desperate cries for help. No evidence that violence had unfolded only hours earlier. Then the door opened. Inside waited a nightmare. Christy Myrick had been brutally murdered. The discovery stunned everyone present. The crime scene revealed extraordinary violence. Investigators immediately recognized they were facing something far beyond a burglary gone wrong or an accidental confrontation. This was personal in its intensity, even if the victim and the killer might never have known each other. The apartment transformed overnight into a maze of yellow evidence markers, fingerprint powder, cameras, notebooks, and unanswered questions. Police officers sealed the building. Detectives arrived. Crime scene technicians documented every inch of the apartment. Every footprint mattered. Every fiber mattered. Every fingerprint mattered. Every drop of biological evidence could become the one detail capable of identifying a killer. But in 1992, forensic science had not yet reached the level that modern investigators often take for granted. DNA testing existed, but its applications remained limited, expensive, and slow. Genetic genealogy, the technology that would one day revolutionize countless cold cases, was still unimaginable. Investigators understood they had evidence. What they lacked was the ability to tell them whose evidence it was. News spread rapidly across Lancaster. Residents struggled to understand how such extraordinary violence could erupt inside a normally peaceful community. Parents who had never worried about locking every door suddenly checked windows before going to sleep. Teachers comforted frightened children while privately wondering whether the killer remained nearby. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some believed Christie had known her attacker. Others insisted a stranger had entered her apartment. Speculation raced through neighborhoods, workplaces, restaurants, and church gatherings. Every conversation ended the same way. Who could have done this? Detectives began reconstructing Christie's final known movements with painstaking precision. She had spent the previous evening preparing for another school day. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, and relatives were interviewed one after another. Every telephone call was documented. Every appointment examined. Every personal relationship scrutinized. The investigation expanded rapidly. Police searched for anyone who may have crossed paths with Christie during the days leading to her death. Former acquaintances, co-workers, maintenance workers, delivery drivers, neighbors, parents connected to the school, friends from church, anyone. No possibility was dismissed too quickly. At the center of every interview stood the same impossible challenge. Christie herself could no longer answer the questions only she knew. Who had she trusted? Had anyone frightened her recently? Did she notice someone following her? Had anyone become unusually interested in her schedule? Those answers disappeared forever with her. The medical examination confirmed investigators' worst fears. Christie had fought desperately for her life. The violence inside the apartment reflected determination, panic, and unimaginable terror. She had resisted her attacker with every ounce of strength available. That struggle, however, also left behind something investigators carefully collected: biological evidence. In another era, detectives might not have fully appreciated its future significance. Fortunately, they preserved it. Carefully. Methodically. Almost certainly without realizing that the evidence would outlive careers, retirements, technological revolutions, and even generations of investigators. Boxes containing physical evidence entered secure storage. Files multiplied. Photographs filled folders. Interview transcripts stacked higher every week. The investigation consumed enormous resources during its earliest months. Tips flooded into police headquarters. Some sounded convincing. Most collapsed under scrutiny. People reported suspicious strangers. Unusual vehicles. Arguments overheard weeks earlier. Men behaving strangely. Anonymous phone calls. Possible sightings. Each lead demanded attention. Each required detectives to spend valuable hours separating coincidence from genuine evidence. Many ended nowhere. Still, investigators refused to surrender. They assembled timelines stretching across entire walls. Maps covered with colored pins documented movements throughout Lancaster County. Potential suspects appeared, then disappeared. Some possessed criminal histories. Others had weak alibis. Several voluntarily cooperated. Some required search warrants. Every promising direction eventually reached another dead end. Meanwhile, Christie's family faced a reality impossible to comprehend. Christmas arrived without her. The holiday transformed forever from celebration into remembrance. Instead of exchanging gifts with their daughter, sister, and loved one, they prepared for a funeral. Photographs, once associated with birthdays, vacations, and family gatherings, suddenly carried unbearable weight. Every smiling image became evidence of a future violently stolen. Friends remembered her laughter. Students remembered her kindness. Parents remembered a teacher who genuinely cared about every child entering her classroom. Those memories contrasted painfully with the brutality investigators described behind closed doors. Whoever committed this crime had extinguished a life filled with promise. The community demanded answers. Local newspapers followed every development. Television stations reported each new lead. Public pressure intensified. Residents wanted reassurance. Parents wanted safety. Police wanted one thing above everything else: a name. Weeks became months. Months slowly became years. Despite relentless investigative work, the case refused to yield its secrets. The physical evidence remained. The killer remained invisible. As forensic laboratories completed available testing, detectives compared results against known suspects. At the time, the available databases were dramatically smaller than those existing decades later. Countless offenders had never submitted DNA samples. Many states had not yet adopted the collection practices now considered standard. Again and again, investigators encountered the same devastating outcome. No match. Every negative result deepened frustration. The evidence clearly belonged to someone. Someone had left it behind. Someone had walked away believing they had escaped forever. Yet the identity attached to that evidence remained hidden. The apartment where Christy spent her final hours eventually returned to ordinary existence. Daily life resumed around it. Cars passed.
Seasons changed.
New residents moved into nearby homes, many unaware they lived beside one of Pennsylvania's darkest crime scenes. But detectives never truly left. Boxes remained accessible. Evidence remained preserved. Case files waited inside shelves that grew older with every passing year. Some investigators retired carrying unanswered questions. Others inherited the investigation from predecessors they deeply respected. Fresh eyes reviewed aging documents. Old witness statements were reread. Forgotten names resurfaced. Telephone records were examined again. Every advancement in forensic science inspired renewed optimism. Maybe this time. Maybe one overlooked detail. Maybe one scientific breakthrough. Maybe one mistake made by the killer decades earlier. As the years passed, the phrase cold case slowly attached itself to Christy Myrick's murder. 2 words. Simple. Clinical. Yet devastating. Because behind those words lived a family still waiting for justice. Behind those words stood detectives refusing to admit defeat. Behind those words remained a killer living somewhere beyond the reach of suspicion, blending into ordinary life, while investigators continued chasing shadows left behind on a winter morning in 1992. No one could imagine that the smallest fragments preserved inside evidence lockers were quietly waiting for a future science that did not yet exist, a science capable of reaching backward through time, following invisible family connections, and exposing a face hidden for decades. For now, however, that future remained impossible to see, and the investigation stood at the edge of an abyss where determination collided with silence, leaving Lancaster haunted by a single terrifying reality. The murderer had vanished, but the evidence had not forgotten. The investigation refused to fade, even as the headlines gradually disappeared from newspaper front pages. In the weeks immediately following Christy Myrick's murder, detectives worked around the clock, convinced that the person responsible had made a mistake somewhere. Crimes of this magnitude rarely unfolded without leaving a trail. The challenge was finding the one thread that could unravel the entire mystery. The apartment became the focal point of an exhaustive forensic examination. Every room was photographed repeatedly from different angles. Investigators documented the position of furniture, collected fingerprints, lifted shoe impressions where possible, and carefully preserved biological evidence that had been left behind during the violent struggle. Even in 1992, detectives recognized that the offender had left valuable forensic material. The problem was not whether evidence existed. The problem was whether science could identify the individual who had left it. The examination established that Christy had been attacked inside her own home. There was no indication that she had disappeared elsewhere before being brought back. The confrontation had occurred where she should have felt safest. The evidence suggested a fierce struggle, confirming that she fought desperately against her attacker. For investigators, that fact carried two meanings. It reflected the terrifying final moments of a young teacher whose life ended far too soon, and it increased the possibility that the offender had inadvertently left behind biological evidence capable of surviving long after memories faded. Detectives widened the investigation beyond the apartment complex. They retraced Christie's final known movements during the previous day, speaking with friends, co-workers, neighbors, and relatives. Her routine appeared remarkably ordinary. She had been preparing for another day of teaching before the upcoming Christmas holiday. Those who knew her consistently described someone dedicated to her students and excited about building her future in Lancaster County. No witness reported seeing behavior that clearly suggested she believed she was in danger. That absence of warning became one of the investigation's earliest frustrations. If someone had threatened her, no one seemed to know. If someone had been stalking her, there was no obvious report. If she had recognized her killer, she never had the opportunity to tell anyone. Police explored multiple investigative theories simultaneously. Could the offender have been someone known to Christie? Was the attack the result of a chance encounter? Had someone entered the apartment intending to commit another crime before events escalated into murder? Each possibility remained open while detectives searched for evidence capable of supporting or eliminating competing explanations. Hundreds of interviews followed. Some individuals came forward voluntarily after hearing news reports. Others were contacted because their names appeared in Christie's personal or professional circles. Detectives examined former acquaintances, maintenance personnel, delivery workers, neighbors, and anyone whose presence near the apartment could be verified. Each interview added another piece to an increasingly complicated puzzle, but none provided the decisive breakthrough investigators desperately needed. As weeks turned into months, forensic laboratories completed the available DNA analysis. The biological evidence recovered from the crime scene produced a profile believed to belong to the attacker. That discovery represented an important achievement, but it also exposed the limitations of forensic science during the early 1990s. Having a DNA profile was not the same as having a suspect. Without a matching sample for comparison, the profile became an unidentified signature attached to an unknown individual. Investigators compared the evidence against persons of interest who emerged during the inquiry. Samples obtained through lawful investigative procedures failed to produce a match. The profile was also compared against available databases as they developed over time. Again, no identification followed. The offender remained anonymous. The lack of progress weighed heavily on everyone involved. Christie's family continued searching for answers while investigators revisited evidence repeatedly, hoping that one overlooked detail might reveal a new direction. Cold case investigations often depend on persistence rather than dramatic breakthroughs, and this case became a clear example of that reality. Each anniversary of Christie's death renewed public attention. Local newspapers revisited the case. Television stations interviewed investigators. Community members expressed the same hope year after year, that someone, somewhere, might remember a forgotten conversation or recognize a detail that once seemed insignificant. Tips continued to arrive. Some originated from anonymous callers. Others came from individuals convinced they had finally identified the mysterious killer. Every lead required careful examination. Most ultimately led nowhere. Despite the disappointment, detectives resisted the temptation to ignore even unlikely information. Experience had taught them that seemingly minor observations occasionally become the key to solving decades-old crimes. Throughout the 1990s, forensic science advanced steadily. DNA testing became more reliable, more sensitive, and increasingly accepted as a powerful investigative tool. Law enforcement agencies across the United States began expanding DNA databases by collecting samples from qualifying offenders. Each expansion created another opportunity for unsolved cases to find answers. Christie's case remained active. Whenever technology improved, investigators revisited the preserved evidence. Whenever procedures changed, laboratories considered whether additional testing could reveal information that earlier methods had missed. This commitment reflected an important principle shared by experienced homicide investigators. Properly preserved evidence often becomes more valuable with time rather than less. The offender had no way of knowing that scientific progress would continue long after the crime itself. Years passed. Detectives retired. New investigators assumed responsibility for the case. Each transition required another careful review of thousands of pages of reports, photographs, laboratory results, interview summaries, and evidence logs. Fresh investigators approached the file without preconceived assumptions, sometimes noticing details that earlier teams had understandably overlooked amid the urgency of the original investigation. Yet even with renewed attention, the central mystery remained unchanged. The DNA profile belonged to someone. No one knew who. For Christie's family, the passage of time created a different kind of burden. Public interest naturally diminished as newer cases occupied headlines. Their loss, however, remained permanent. Holidays continued to arrive without Christie. Birthdays became reminders of milestones she would never reach. Every passing year emphasized not only the absence of justice, but also the life that had been taken at just 25 years old. Investigators frequently acknowledged the family's resilience. They continued cooperating with law enforcement, supporting renewed investigative efforts whenever advances in science offered fresh possibilities. Their determination mirrored that of detectives who refused to close the file despite repeated disappointments. By the early 2000s, the case had become one of Lancaster County's best-known unsolved homicides. It was no longer simply an active investigation. It had become a test of patience, a test of memory, a test of whether science could eventually succeed where traditional detective work had reached its limits. The evidence remained secure. The DNA profile remained intact. Somewhere, investigators believed, the individual responsible continued living an ordinary life, perhaps convinced that the passage of time guaranteed permanent freedom. History would ultimately prove that assumption dangerously mistaken. The next major chapter in the investigation would not begin with a confession or an eyewitness suddenly stepping forward. Instead, it would emerge from an entirely new way of thinking about DNA, one that extended beyond direct database matches and into the complex network of family relationships encoded within human genetics. That scientific revolution was still taking shape, but once it matured, it would transform not only the investigation into Christy Merrick's murder, but also the future of cold case investigations across the United States. The years after Christy Merrick's murder created a painful contradiction. The case was not forgotten by those who worked on it, yet for the outside world, time slowly pushed the tragedy further into the past. New crimes appeared. New investigations demanded attention. New headlines replaced old ones. But inside the files stored by law enforcement, one question remained unchanged. Who killed Christy Merrick? The answer had remained hidden for more than 2 decades. The evidence was still there. The questions were still there. But the identity of the person behind the crime remained locked away. For investigators, cold cases are rarely truly closed. They exist in a strange space between the past and the present, waiting for something to change. A witness may suddenly remember a forgotten detail. A suspect may make a mistake years later. A new technology may reveal information that was impossible to discover before. For Christie's case, that breakthrough would come from the rapidly changing world of forensic genetics. Before genetic genealogy became widely known, traditional DNA investigations followed a simple path. Investigators collected biological evidence from a crime scene, developed a DNA profile, and compared that profile against known samples. If the person had previously entered a DNA database, a match could identify a suspect. But if the person had never been tested, the DNA profile could only confirm one fact. The killer's DNA existed. The killer's name did not. That limitation was the barrier that stood between investigators and justice for years. The DNA recovered in Christy Merrick's case became a silent witness. It could reveal biological information, but it could not speak directly. It could not tell detectives where the person lived, what they looked like, or why they had entered Christie's life on that December morning. Then science began to change. A new approach emerged from the world of genealogy, the study of family history. Millions of people around the world had begun submitting their own DNA samples to commercial databases, hoping to discover ancestry connections or distant relatives. These databases were never created specifically for criminal investigations, but they contained something law enforcement had never had before: a massive network of genetic relationships. Scientists realized that DNA could reveal not only a person's identity, but also connections between relatives. Even if a suspect had never submitted a sample, a close or distant family member might have. The idea was revolutionary. Instead of asking, "Does this DNA belong to someone already known?" investigators could now ask a different question. Who in the world is genetically connected to this unknown person? That shift opened a new door. Across the United States, investigators began revisiting decades-old cases that had reached dead ends. Evidence once considered unable to provide answers was being tested again with newer methods. Crimes that had haunted families for generations suddenly had possibilities that detectives from earlier eras could never have imagined. The impact was dramatic. Cases once frozen in time began moving again. Names that had disappeared from investigative files returned. Unknown offenders were identified. Families who had waited years for answers finally received them. For Lancaster County investigators, this new era created hope that Christie's case might finally move forward. But genetic genealogy was not a simple solution. It required careful scientific analysis, extensive research, and experienced investigators capable of translating genetic relationships into real-world identities. A DNA connection could point toward a family tree, but it did not immediately reveal the person responsible. The process required patience. Researchers began with the unknown DNA profile recovered from the crime scene. That profile was compared through appropriate genetic genealogy methods to search for possible relatives. The goal was not to instantly find a suspect, but to build a map of biological connections. Every relative became a potential clue. Every branch of a family tree became a possible pathway. Investigators followed generations of relationships, examining names, locations, ages, and timelines. They searched for patterns that could lead them closer to the person whose DNA had been preserved since 1992. The investigation had entered a completely different phase. For nearly 30 years, detectives had been looking backward through traditional evidence. Now they were looking forward through genetics. The process slowly began narrowing the possibilities. A vast universe of potential identities became smaller. The unknown DNA profile was no longer just an anonymous biological signature. It was becoming connected to real families, real histories, and real individuals. Eventually, investigators focused their attention on a man named Raymond DJ Rowe. At the time, Rowe was not publicly known as a suspect. He was living an ordinary life in Pennsylvania, working as a local radio personality and DJ. To many people who knew him, he appeared outgoing and familiar, a person associated with music, entertainment, and community events. But behind the scenes, investigators were examining a connection that could change everything. The question was no longer whether the DNA profile belonged to someone unknown. The question was whether science had finally led them to the person responsible. Investigators still needed confirmation. Genetic genealogy could generate leads, but criminal cases required direct evidence. Detectives needed to verify that the biological material from the crime scene matched Rowe himself. A careful investigation followed. Authorities began collecting additional evidence. They examined his background. They reviewed his connection to the area. They compared timelines. Every detail mattered. After nearly 3 decades of uncertainty, investigators were approaching the moment the case had been waiting for since 1992. The breakthrough was not the result of one dramatic confession. It was not a sudden witness appearance. It was the result of thousands of small scientific and investigative steps accumulated over time. The fingerprints, photographs, interviews, and evidence collected decades earlier had not failed. They had been waiting for technology to catch up. When detectives finally obtained a DNA sample from Rowe and compared it with the crime scene evidence, the result delivered the confirmation investigators had pursued for generations. The DNA matched. The unknown profile from Christy Myrick's murder finally had a name. After 25 years of uncertainty, the person connected to the evidence left behind inside her apartment had been identified. For Christy's family, the news carried emotions that were impossible to describe with a single word: relief, anger, grief. A painful realization that the person responsible had lived freely for decades while they continued waiting for justice. For investigators, it represented one of the most significant moments in the case's history. The cold case that had resisted countless attempts to solve had finally broken open. But identifying the suspect was only the beginning. The investigation now entered another critical stage. Prosecutors needed to prove what happened on that winter morning in 1992. They needed to present evidence capable of answering the questions that had remained unanswered for so long. Why Christy? How did the attack happen? How did the killer come to be inside her apartment? And how could a crime hidden for nearly 30 years finally be brought before a courtroom? The DNA had opened the door. Now the justice system had to walk through it. The identification of Raymond D.J. Rowe marked the moment when a nearly 3-decade-old mystery finally began moving toward justice. For years, Christy Myrick's murder had existed as an unanswered question inside Lancaster County. Investigators had carried the weight of the case through changing decades, changing technology, and changing generations of detectives. Now, for the first time since December 1992, the investigation had a person at the center of it. But an arrest was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new battle. The challenge was no longer finding the unknown killer. The challenge was proving, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the man identified through DNA was the same person responsible for taking Christy's life. On December 19, 2017, authorities announced the arrest of Raymond D.J. Rowe, a local radio personality who had become known in the community as a performer and entertainer. The news shocked many people who knew him. To those outside the investigation, Rowe appeared to have lived a normal life. He had built relationships, developed a public identity, and existed in the community without suspicion for decades. But investigators were focused on a different identity. The identity revealed by science. The identity connected to evidence preserved from a crime scene nearly 25 years earlier. The arrest immediately reopened memories of a case many residents had never forgotten. For families who had followed the investigation since 1992, the announcement was both unexpected and long-awaited. The name of the person responsible was finally public. The silence surrounding Christy's murder had been broken. As prosecutors prepared their case, they began assembling the evidence that would explain how investigators reached Rowe. The DNA evidence was the foundation, but a successful prosecution required a complete picture. The jury would need to understand not only that DNA connected Rowe to the crime scene, but also why that connection mattered. The investigation revealed that genetic genealogy had played a critical role in identifying potential relatives connected to the unknown DNA profile. Researchers worked through family relationships and historical records, gradually narrowing the field until investigators reached Roe as a possible source. This process represented a major turning point in modern criminal investigations. Traditional detective work had followed leads outward from the crime scene. Genetic genealogy followed a different path. It traveled through family connections, generations, and biological relationships until the unknown individual behind the evidence became visible. The method had solved a mystery that had survived nearly every traditional investigative technique available during the 1990s and early 2000s. But as the case moved toward trial, investigators also faced questions about the passage of time. 25 years had passed. Memories had changed. People had moved. Buildings had changed. Some witnesses were older. Some evidence had become difficult to explain because the world around the crime had transformed. Yet the most important piece of evidence had survived. The DNA profile. That evidence represented a direct link between the crime scene and the man now accused. Investigators believed Roe's connection to Christie's murder was not simply a coincidence. The biological evidence placed him at the center of the case in a way no previous suspect had been. The arrest also forced the public to confront an unsettling reality about cold cases. Sometimes the person responsible is not a stranger hiding in the shadows. Sometimes the person has continued living an ordinary life. They work. They interact with others. They build friendships. They become part of the community around them. Meanwhile, families of victims continue carrying a loss that never disappears. For Christie's family, the years without answers had been filled with questions that had no resolution. Every holiday, every birthday, every anniversary carried the reminder that the person responsible had not been identified. The arrest changed that. But it could not erase what happened. No courtroom decision could return Christie to the classroom. No scientific breakthrough could restore the years her family had lost. Justice could only address the crime. It could not undo the tragedy. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they examined the circumstances surrounding Christie's death. They presented evidence showing that she had been attacked inside her home and that the offender had left behind biological material during the violent encounter. The case depended heavily on forensic science, but investigators also worked to reconstruct the broader story. Who was Christie Myrick? Why did her death matter? What kind of life had been interrupted? Because behind every piece of evidence was a person. Christie was not simply a name in a case file. She was a young teacher who had moved to Pennsylvania to begin a new chapter. She was someone whose students remembered her enthusiasm and kindness. She was someone whose family remembered her as a daughter and loved one. The prosecution's task was not only to prove guilt. It was also to restore the human story behind the headlines. In the months following Roe's arrest, more details about the investigation became public. The community followed every development closely. After decades of uncertainty, people wanted to understand how the case had finally been solved and how the evidence had remained hidden for so long. The answer reflected the evolution of science itself. In 1992, investigators had collected evidence using the technology available at the time. They had done their work. They had preserved what they could. They had created the foundation for a future breakthrough they could not have predicted. Decades later, another generation of investigators used tools that did not exist when the crime occurred. The past and the future had finally connected. The evidence from a winter morning in 1992 met the technology of a new century. And together, they produced a name. As the legal process continued, attention shifted toward the courtroom. The prosecution would need to explain the evidence clearly, while the defense would challenge the interpretation of that evidence and the circumstances surrounding the investigation. Every major criminal trial is a test. Not only of evidence, but of whether that evidence can withstand examination from every possible angle. For a case built around decades-old events, that challenge was especially significant. The prosecution believed the DNA evidence provided the answer investigators had searched for since the beginning. The defense would argue that the passage of time created uncertainty and that every piece of evidence required careful evaluation. The courtroom would become the final stage of a journey that began in a quiet apartment in Lancaster County and continued through years of unanswered questions. A young teacher's death had become one of Pennsylvania's most closely watched cold cases. A preserved DNA sample had become the bridge between past and present. And a technology once considered impossible had transformed an investigation that many feared would never be solved. For nearly 30 years, the question had remained the same. Who killed Christy Myrick? Now, that question had an answer. But the full story of what happened inside that courtroom and how justice was finally delivered was still waiting to unfold. The courtroom would become the place where decades of uncertainty collided with evidence preserved from the past. After years of investigation, countless interviews, and technological breakthroughs that transformed the case, the question facing the justice system was no longer whether Christy Myrick's murder had occurred. That had never been in doubt. The question was whether the evidence could prove, with certainty, who was responsible. When Raymond D.J. Rowe appeared in court, the case represented something larger than one prosecution. It had become a symbol of how modern forensic science could reopen investigations that once seemed impossible to solve. Across the country, law enforcement agencies were watching similar cases emerge from decades of silence. Evidence once considered limited had gained new meaning through advances in DNA technology. For Christy's family, however, this was not about scientific history. It was about a person they loved. It was about a young woman whose life ended before she had the opportunity to experience the future she was building. The trial brought the details of December 21, 1992, back into public attention. Investigators described how Christy failed to arrive at school that morning, creating immediate concern among colleagues who knew her as a dependable teacher. The discovery inside her apartment changed everything. A routine winter day became the beginning of an investigation that would continue for decades. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence as the central element of the case. The biological material collected from the crime scene had remained preserved for years, waiting for technology to advance enough to reveal its connection. The scientific process that led investigators to Rowe was carefully examined. Jurors learned how genetic genealogy allowed investigators to move beyond traditional database searches and explore possible family connections. This approach created a path toward identifying a person whose DNA had never previously appeared in standard law enforcement databases. The breakthrough demonstrated a fundamental change in criminal investigations. For decades, investigators had been limited by one question. Does this DNA belong to someone already known? Genetic genealogy introduced another possibility. Who is connected to this DNA through family history? That change transformed the investigation. A profile that once represented an unknown person became a map of relationships. Researchers followed those connections, analyzing family trees and historical records until investigators reached a possible suspect. But science alone did not determine guilt. The courtroom required more than a genetic trail. It required proof. The prosecution explained how additional DNA testing connected Rowe directly to the biological evidence recovered from the crime scene. The match became the critical link between the unknown offender from 1992 and the man sitting before the court decades later. For investigators who had carried the case through years of uncertainty, the moment represented the conclusion of a long pursuit. But for those who loved Christy, the emotional reality was more complicated. A conviction could bring accountability. It could confirm the truth. But it could never reverse the loss. During the trial, the person behind the case file became visible again. Jurors heard about Christy not only as a victim, but as a teacher, a daughter, and a member of the community. her life before the crime became an essential part of understanding what had been taken away. She had been beginning her career. She had been building relationships with students. She had been creating a future. That future ended in a moment of violence. The prosecution argued that the evidence showed Rowe was responsible for that violence. They presented the DNA connection as the strongest piece of evidence, supported by the circumstances surrounding the crime and the investigation that followed. The defense challenged aspects of the prosecution's case, as is expected in any criminal proceeding. Every detail was examined. Every assumption was questioned. The jury's responsibility was to evaluate the evidence and determine whether it met the legal standard required for conviction. After hearing the testimony and reviewing the evidence, the jury reached its decision. Raymond D.J. Rowe was found guilty of murder. The verdict closed one chapter of the case, but the impact of Christy Merrick's death continued to be felt by everyone connected to the investigation. For law enforcement, it was a reminder that unsolved cases can remain solvable when evidence is preserved and investigators refuse to abandon the search for answers. For the forensic community, the case demonstrated the growing power of genetic genealogy. For families of victims across the country, it represented hope. A case that once appeared frozen forever had moved forward. A name once unknown had been identified. A family that had waited decades finally received a measure of justice. Yet the story of Christy Merrick's murder was not only about the person who committed the crime. It was also about the people who spent years refusing to let her memory disappear. Detectives who reviewed old files. Laboratory specialists who preserved evidence. Researchers who followed genetic connections. Prosecutors who prepared the case. Family members who continued waiting for answers. Each played a role in bringing the truth into the open. The investigation also raised important conversations about the future of forensic technology. Genetic genealogy offered extraordinary opportunities, but it also created new discussions about privacy, consent, and the balance between solving crimes and protecting personal genetic information. The technology that helped identify Christy's killer changed the way investigators viewed cold cases. It showed that evidence does not necessarily expire with time. Sometimes it waits quietly until science develops the ability to understand it. The DNA collected in 1992 had no immediate answer. But it carried one. For nearly 25 years, that evidence remained connected to an unknown individual. It survived changes in investigators, changes in technology, and changes in society. When the right tools finally arrived, the evidence provided the breakthrough that generations of detectives had hoped for. The case of Christy Merrick became part of a new era in criminal investigation. An era where the past could speak. Where forgotten evidence could return. Where families who had spent years without answers could finally learn the truth. But even after the verdict, one reality remained impossible to ignore. Justice arrives after tragedy. It does not prevent tragedy. Nothing could restore the life that was lost on that December morning. Nothing could return Christy to the classroom where she had inspired her students. Nothing could erase the years her family spent waiting. The courtroom provided an ending to the investigation. But the memory of Christy Merrick continued beyond the verdict. Her name remained connected not only to a crime, but to the people who remembered her kindness, dedication, and the promise of a life interrupted too soon. And as the years moved forward, her case remained a powerful reminder that even the coldest investigations can still hold answers, sometimes hidden in the smallest pieces of evidence, waiting for the moment when science finally catches up with the truth. The conviction of Raymond D.J. Rowe brought a legal conclusion to one of Pennsylvania's most closely followed cold cases, but the story of Christy Merrick's murder continued to echo far beyond the courtroom. The case had traveled through nearly 3 decades of uncertainty, through changing generations of investigators, and through a transformation in forensic science that changed how law enforcement approached unsolved crimes. For many people, the most remarkable part of the case was not only that the killer was identified after so many years.
It was how.
In 1992, detectives had worked with the tools available to them. They collected evidence, interviewed witnesses, and followed every possible lead. They did what investigators had always done. They searched for answers through human observation, physical evidence, and traditional police work. But the investigation reached a point where those methods could go no further. The evidence existed. The truth existed. Yet the connection between the two remained hidden. That changed decades later when science created a new path. The development of genetic genealogy represented one of the biggest shifts in modern criminal investigations. Instead of relying only on direct DNA matches, investigators could explore genetic relationships that extended across generations. A person who had never entered a law enforcement database could still become identifiable through relatives who had voluntarily shared genetic information for ancestry research. This approach changed the meaning of DNA evidence. Previously, an unknown profile was often a dead end. Now, it could become the beginning of a search. The investigation into Christy Myrick's murder became an example of how old evidence could gain new power. The biological material collected in the early 1990s had survived because investigators preserved it carefully. The technology needed to fully interpret it simply had not existed yet. The case demonstrated an important lesson in forensic investigations. Evidence does not always become less valuable with time. Sometimes, it becomes more valuable as science advances. For the detectives involved, the breakthrough represented the fulfillment of a promise made decades earlier. Cold case investigators often inherit unfinished stories. They do not know when or even if they will find answers. Many spend entire careers carrying unresolved cases. Some retire without seeing the conclusion. Some never know whether the person responsible will ever be identified. The Christy Myrick investigation crossed multiple generations of law enforcement. Officers who first responded to the crime scene in 1992 could not have imagined that future investigators would one day use genetic technology to solve the case.
The tools changed.
The mission did not. Find the truth. Bring accountability. Remember the victim. That final point remained central throughout the investigation. While headlines often focused on the suspect, the arrest, the DNA breakthrough, and the courtroom proceedings, the heart of the case was always Christy herself. Before she became the subject of a criminal investigation, she was a young woman with plans, ambitions, and relationships. She was a teacher. She was a friend. She was a family member. She was someone whose life mattered beyond the circumstances of her death. Those who knew Christy described her as someone who cared deeply about her students. Teaching was not simply a job for her. It was a responsibility she embraced. She entered the classroom with the belief that educators could influence the lives of children and help shape their futures. That was the person remembered by the people closest to her. Not only the victim in a famous case. Not only the name attached to a criminal investigation, but a person whose absence left a permanent space in the lives of others. The passage of time created another challenge for the case. As decades passed, a younger generation grew up knowing only fragments of the story. Some residents who moved into the area years later were unaware of the tragedy that had occurred nearby. The neighborhood changed. The community changed. But for those who had lived through the investigation, the memory remained. Cold cases create unusual relationships between the past and present. A crime may happen in a single moment, but its consequences continue for years. Families experience the loss repeatedly. Communities remember the fear. Investigators revisit the unanswered questions. And evidence waits silently for the opportunity to reveal what it knows. The resolution of Christie's case also influenced conversations about other unsolved crimes. Law enforcement agencies across the country began examining old evidence through new technologies. Cases once considered permanently unresolved were reopened. Investigators returned to evidence rooms, searching for material that could now provide answers. The success of genetic genealogy created optimism, but it also introduced new responsibilities. Every breakthrough required careful consideration of scientific accuracy, legal standards, and ethical questions. DNA information is deeply personal, and the use of genetic databases in criminal investigations created discussions about privacy and consent. The same technology that brought justice to families also required society to consider how that technology should be used responsibly. The case of Christy Myrick existed at the center of that national conversation. It represented both the power of modern science and the importance of careful investigation. But for her family, the meaning was much more personal. They were not seeking a scientific milestone. They were seeking answers. They wanted to know who had taken Christy from them. They wanted recognition of what she had lost. They wanted the person responsible held accountable. The conviction provided those answers. But grief does not disappear when a case ends. Families of homicide victims often describe justice as something complicated. It can provide relief and confirmation, but it does not erase memories of the person who is gone. It cannot restore missed birthdays, future celebrations, or the ordinary moments that would have filled the years. A verdict can close a courtroom. It cannot close a lifetime of memories. That reality became part of the lasting legacy of Christy Myrick's case. The investigation showed the world that time does not always protect those responsible for terrible crimes. A person may avoid identification for years, even decades, but evidence can remain. Technology can evolve. Investigators can continue searching. And the truth can eventually emerge. The winter morning in 1992 began as an ordinary day. For Christy Myrick, it became the final day of her life. For investigators, it became a mission that lasted decades. For the forensic world, it became a case study in the future of criminal investigation. And for her family and community, it became a reminder that behind every cold case is a person whose story deserves to be remembered. The discovery of the killer answered one question that had haunted Lancaster County for years. But another question remained just as important. How should a community remember someone whose life was defined not by the tragedy that ended it, but by the kindness and dedication she showed before that moment? The answer came through the memories of those who knew her. Through former students. Through friends. Through family. Through the people who refused to allow a crime to become the only story attached to her name. Because long after the courtroom doors closed and the investigation files were archived, the most important part of Christy Myrick's story remained the life she lived before the world knew her as a victim. The story of Christy Myrick's murder had traveled a path few investigations ever follow. It began as a local tragedy on a quiet December morning in Pennsylvania, became one of Lancaster County's most persistent cold cases, and eventually transformed into a landmark example of how modern DNA technology could reach across decades to uncover the truth. But behind every investigation file, every forensic report, and every courtroom argument, there remained a deeper human story. A life interrupted. A family forced to wait. A community left with unanswered questions. And a generation of investigators who refused to allow time to erase what happened. When detectives first arrived at Christy's apartment in 1992, they were confronted with a crime scene that demanded immediate action. The investigation moved quickly because every hour mattered. Early evidence collection, witness interviews, and forensic examination created the foundation that would later become critical decades afterward. At the time, no one could know that the most important evidence collected during those first days would remain silent for years. The investigators working the case were operating in a different era. Digital records were limited. DNA technology was still developing. Databases that now allow investigators to search millions of profiles did not exist in anything close to their modern form. The tools were different. The expectations were different. But the dedication was the same. Detectives followed every available lead because behind the evidence was a person who deserved justice. As the years passed, The case became a symbol of the challenges faced by cold case investigators everywhere. These investigations often begin with urgency and slowly transform into long-term missions. The original detectives may retire. Witnesses may move away. Memories may become less clear. Physical locations may change. Yet the responsibility remains. Every unanswered homicide represents a promise that justice has not been completed. For Christie's case, that promise continued through multiple generations of investigators. Some detectives inherited boxes of documents created by people they had never met. They studied reports written decades earlier, examined photographs from an older era, and attempted to understand the decisions made by investigators who came before them. Cold case work requires a unique combination of patience and curiosity. It requires investigators willing to ask questions that others may have already asked. It requires the willingness to examine old information from a new perspective. And sometimes it requires waiting for science to provide a tool that did not exist when the crime occurred. That tool eventually arrived through advances in forensic genealogy. The technology did not replace traditional investigation. Instead, it expanded what investigators could do. The original evidence remained the foundation. The new science simply allowed investigators to see information that had always been there. This became one of the most important lessons from Christy Myrick's case. The breakthrough did not come because the original investigation failed. It came because time created new possibilities. The evidence collected in 1992 was preserved. The investigation continued. And when technology advanced enough, the two finally connected. The identification of Raymond D.J. Rowe demonstrated the extraordinary reach of modern DNA analysis, but it also highlighted the complexity of solving crimes decades later. Investigators were not simply searching for a name. They were reconstructing history. They had to understand where the evidence came from, how it connected to a person, and whether that connection could withstand legal examination. Every step required accuracy. Every conclusion required verification. Because in a criminal case, suspicion is not enough. The evidence must tell a complete story. The prosecution's success depended on presenting that story clearly. Jurors needed to understand not only the science behind the DNA match, but also the human reality surrounding the crime. They needed to see Christy as more than a victim in a case file. They needed to understand the person whose life had been taken. The details of her career as a teacher became an important part of remembering her. Her students and colleagues described someone committed to education and dedicated to helping children learn. Teaching requires patience. It requires empathy. It requires believing that small actions can influence another person's future. Those qualities defined how many people remembered Christy. The crime that ended her life was shocking because it stood in such contrast to the person she was known to be. A caring teacher became the center of a murder investigation. A promising future became a decades-long search for justice. A community that once knew her through daily life came to know her through headlines. But the people closest to Christy continued protecting the memory of who she was before the tragedy. That distinction mattered. Because every victim of a violent crime has a story that begins long before the moment they are harmed. The investigation into Christy's death also became part of a larger shift in public understanding of cold cases. For decades, many people believed that if a crime remained unsolved for a certain amount of time, the chances of finding answers became almost impossible. Modern forensic breakthroughs challenged that belief. Cases once considered lost were reopened. Evidence once considered limited was examined again. Families who had waited years received unexpected phone calls bringing news they never thought they would hear. The advancement of DNA technology created a new era of accountability. But it also changed the relationship between past and present. A crime committed decades earlier could suddenly become a current investigation again. A name buried in old records could become relevant. A forgotten piece of evidence could become the key. This transformation changed how law enforcement approached unresolved cases. Instead of viewing time as the enemy, investigators began seeing time as something that could sometimes work in their favor. The longer an offender lived, the more opportunities existed for mistakes, records, relationships, and technology to reveal the truth. For the person responsible for Christie's murder, decades passed without identification. But those decades also allowed science to evolve. The same passage of time that created distance from the crime eventually helped close the gap between evidence and identity. The case became a reminder that avoiding detection is not the same as escaping responsibility. The absence of an answer does not mean there is no answer. Sometimes it means the answer has not yet been discovered. As the investigation moved into history, Christy Myrick's name remained connected to a larger conversation about justice, technology, and memory. Her case showed what can happen when evidence is preserved and when investigators continue searching despite years of uncertainty. It showed that behind every cold case is a person whose life mattered. And it showed that even after decades of silence, the truth can still find a way forward. The story that began with unanswered questions eventually became a story about persistence. Persistence from investigators. Persistence from family. Persistence from a community that refused to let a young teacher's life be reduced to a single tragic moment. Because the final chapter of a cold case is not only about identifying the person responsible, it is also about restoring the name and memory of the person who was lost. And for Christy Myrick, that memory would continue beyond the courtroom, beyond the headlines, and beyond the investigation that lasted for nearly 3 decades. The resolution of Christy Myrick's case represented a powerful moment in the history of cold case investigations, but the impact extended far beyond one courtroom in Pennsylvania. The investigation became part of a broader transformation in the way law enforcement viewed unsolved crimes. It demonstrated that cases once considered beyond reach could still contain answers, hidden inside evidence that had been waiting for the right moment. For decades, cold cases carried a painful reputation. They were files filled with unanswered questions. They were investigations interrupted by time. They were reminders that some families never received the closure they deserved. But the discovery of new forensic methods changed that perception. The case of Christy Myrick showed that time does not always erase evidence. Sometimes, time allows evidence to become more powerful. The DNA collected from the crime scene in 1992 existed long before the technology needed to fully use it. Investigators preserved what they could, even though they had no way of knowing exactly how valuable that evidence would become in the future. That uncertainty is one of the defining challenges of criminal investigations. Detectives must collect evidence for tomorrow while solving crimes today. They must preserve details that may not reveal their importance immediately. They must trust that future science may provide answers that current science cannot. In Christie's case, that trust was rewarded. The investigation became an example of how cooperation between generations of law enforcement professionals can change the outcome of a case. The officers who responded in 1992, the detectives who reviewed the files years later, the forensic specialists who analyzed the evidence, and the investigators who followed the genetic leads all contributed to the final result. No single moment solved the case. No single person created the breakthrough. It was the accumulation of effort over time. The crime scene evidence. The original investigation. The preserved DNA. The technological advancement. The renewed examination. All of those pieces eventually connected. That reality is often overlooked when people hear about major forensic breakthroughs. The final discovery may happen in one dramatic moment, but it is usually built on years of careful work. The same was true for Christy Myrick's case. The genetic genealogy process attracted significant attention because it represented a new approach to solving crimes. However, behind the scientific breakthrough was a complex investigative process requiring patience and precision. DNA connections had to be interpreted carefully. Family relationships had to be examined. Historical records had to be reviewed. Potential individuals had to be evaluated. Investigators had to ensure that every step followed proper procedures. The goal was not simply to find someone connected to the DNA. The goal was to find the person whose DNA matched the evidence and whose connection could be proven in court. That distinction was essential. Scientific tools can open doors, but the justice system requires evidence strong enough to support a conclusion. The success of the investigation also created renewed hope for other families living with unresolved cases. Across the country, relatives of homicide victims began wondering whether their own cases might one day experience a similar breakthrough. Could preserved evidence from decades earlier finally reveal answers? Could a forgotten investigation move forward? Could a name hidden for years finally become known? Those questions became increasingly common as genetic genealogy gained attention. For law enforcement agencies, the technology created new possibilities but also new responsibilities. Investigators had to balance the power of genetic information with careful consideration of privacy and ethical concerns. DNA contains deeply personal information. The same technology capable of identifying a violent offender can also reveal information about innocent relatives who never expected to become connected to a criminal investigation. The growth of genetic genealogy forced society to confront difficult questions. How should genetic information be used? Who should have access to it? What protections are necessary? These conversations became part of the larger legacy surrounding cases like Christy Mirick's. The investigation demonstrated the extraordinary potential of science, but it also highlighted the importance of responsible use. For Christy's family, however, the significance remained personal. They were not focused on the broader scientific debate. They were focused on the person they lost. A case that appeared in newspapers and television reports was, to them, a permanent part of their lives. The passage of 25 years did not reduce the impact of the loss. Time changes many things. People grow older. Communities evolve. Technology advances. But grief remains connected to the moment someone's life changes forever. The verdict could confirm the truth. It could hold the offender accountable. It could provide an answer. But it could not return the years that had passed. It could not restore the future Christy never experienced. It could not erase the memories of those who had waited. That is the complicated reality of justice in homicide cases. Justice is necessary. But justice cannot undo tragedy. It can only acknowledge it. It can only recognize the harm caused and establish responsibility. In that sense, the conclusion of Christy Mirick's case served two purposes. It answered the question of who was responsible, and it reaffirmed that her life mattered. The investigation was not simply about identifying a killer. It was about remembering a person whose future had been taken away. That became one of the most important messages surrounding the case. The victim must remain at the center of the story. The technology, the investigation, and the courtroom are all parts of the process. But the reason the process exists is because a life was lost. Christy's story continued through the people who remembered her. Former students carried memories of a teacher who cared about their education. Friends remembered her personality and kindness. Family members remembered the person she was before the tragedy defined public attention. Those memories provided a fuller picture of Christy than any criminal investigation document ever could. They showed that she was more than the circumstances of her death. She was a person with dreams. A person with relationships. A person with a future. The investigation ended with a conviction, but the memory of Christy continued through those connections. Years after the arrest and trial, the case remained an important example of how persistence and science can work together. It showed that unsolved does not always mean unsolvable. It showed that evidence can survive. It showed that investigators can return to old questions with new tools. And it showed that families who wait for answers are not always waiting in vain. The quiet apartment where the investigation began became part of a much larger story about justice and innovation. A crime from 1992 became a case study for the future. A piece of evidence collected decades earlier became a bridge between generations. And a young teacher whose life ended too soon became remembered not only because of the tragedy that surrounded her death, but because of the determination to uncover the truth about what happened. The case had reached its legal conclusion. But the impact of that journey continued. Because every cold case solved carries a message for the cases still waiting. Some answers take years. Some take decades. But as long as evidence remains and people continue searching, the possibility of justice remains alive. The conclusion of the Christy Myrick investigation did more than solve a single homicide. It changed the way many people viewed the possibility of justice after decades of silence. For years, families across the country had lived with the same painful reality: a loved one taken away, a case left unresolved, and a future filled with questions that seemed destined to remain unanswered. The breakthrough in Lancaster County offered a different possibility. Time could pass. Evidence could become old. But the truth could still survive. The case became a reminder that investigations do not always end when the first wave of searches and interviews produces no answer. Sometimes they enter a different phase. A phase where patience becomes the most important tool. A phase where evidence waits for the world of science to catch up. For the investigators who worked on Christie's case, that patience defined the journey. The original detectives who responded in 1992 could not have predicted how the investigation would eventually unfold. They worked with the technology and information available at the time. Their responsibility was to document the scene, preserve evidence, and search for answers. They did exactly that. Decades later, another generation of investigators inherited their work. They were not starting from the beginning. They were continuing a story that had never truly ended. This is the reality of cold case investigations. They are rarely solved by one dramatic discovery. Instead, they are built through layers of effort created by people who may never meet each other. One investigator collects evidence. Another reviews old reports. A forensic scientist develops a new method. A researcher discovers a connection. A prosecutor presents the final case. Each person contributes a piece. The final picture only appears when those pieces come together. The Christy Myrick investigation reflected this process clearly. The evidence that ultimately identified the killer had been present since the beginning. The difference was not the evidence itself. The difference was the ability to understand it. The rise of advanced DNA analysis changed criminal investigations around the world. What once appeared to be an impossible question, who left this biological evidence behind, became a question that science could increasingly answer. But the technology was only one part of the story. The success of the investigation also depended on the commitment to preserve evidence and continue searching. Without preservation, there would have been no breakthrough. Without persistence, there would have been no renewed investigation. Without careful examination, there would have been no path to the truth. The case also demonstrated how much criminal investigations had changed since 1992. At the time of Christie's murder, computers were not central to everyday police work in the way they are today. Digital records were limited. Investigative databases were smaller. Communication methods were slower. Modern investigators operate in a completely different environment. They can analyze information faster. They can compare evidence across larger databases. They can use technology that previous generations could not imagine. But even with these advances, the foundation remains the same. Careful investigation. Attention to detail. Respect for evidence. And a commitment to the victim. Those principles connected the first day of the investigation to the final resolution. The public often remembers cold cases through their most dramatic moments: the arrest, the courtroom, the scientific breakthrough. But the reality is usually quieter. It is found in the years of work that happen away from cameras. The late nights reviewing documents. The repeated examination of old evidence. The conversations with people who may hold a forgotten detail. The patience required when answers do not come quickly. That invisible work is what allows major breakthroughs to happen. In Christie's case, the breakthrough brought long-awaited recognition that her death had not been forgotten. Her name had remained in investigative files. Her story had remained important. The search for answers had continued. For many families affected by violent crime, one of the most painful experiences is feeling that the world has moved on while they remain trapped in the moment of loss. Cold cases create that feeling. The calendar continues moving. The investigation slows. Public attention fades. But for families, the absence remains. The resolution of Christie's case showed the importance of keeping those stories alive. A case does not become less important because time passes. A victim does not become less important because years go by. The passage of time may change the investigation, but it does not change the value of the person who was lost. That message became one of the strongest parts of Christie's legacy. She was remembered as a teacher who cared about her students. She was remembered as a person with compassion and dedication. She was remembered by people whose lives she touched. The murder investigation became a significant part of her public story, but it was not the whole story. Her life before the crime mattered. Her relationships mattered. Her contributions mattered. The tragedy that ended her life did not erase the years that came before it. As the case entered history, it also became part of a broader discussion about the role of technology in solving crime. Genetic genealogy continued developing, and more law enforcement agencies explored how similar approaches could assist with other unresolved cases. The possibilities were enormous. But so were the responsibilities. Every new investigative tool requires careful use. Every new capability requires consideration of accuracy, privacy, and fairness. The future of criminal investigations would depend not only on what science could do, but also on how society chose to use it. Christy Merrick's case stood at an important moment in that evolution. It showed the extraordinary power of DNA. It showed the value of preserving evidence. And it showed the importance of never assuming that a case is beyond hope. For nearly 3 decades, the answer to one question remained hidden. Who was responsible? Eventually, that answer emerged. Not because the past disappeared, but because the past was preserved. The evidence survived. The investigation continued. And the truth eventually found a way forward. The story of Christy Merrick's murder began with uncertainty. It moved through years of frustration. It reached a breakthrough through science. And it ended with accountability. But the final meaning of the case was not only about the person convicted. It was about everyone who refused to stop searching. It was about investigators who continued asking questions. It was about scientists who developed new ways to interpret evidence. It was about a family that waited for answers. And it was about a young teacher whose memory remained important long after her life was taken. Because in every cold case, there is more than an investigation. There is a person. And behind every piece of evidence, there is a story waiting to be heard. The story of Christy Merrick's murder reached its legal conclusion, but the impact of the case continued long after the courtroom proceedings ended. The investigation had become more than a search for a suspect. It had become a demonstration of how determination, evidence preservation, and scientific progress could transform a case that once appeared destined to remain unanswered. For nearly 25 years, the identity of the person responsible remained unknown. A DNA profile existed. A crime scene existed. A family continued waiting. But the connection between the evidence and the individual behind it remained hidden. That changed when modern forensic methods created a new path toward the truth. The breakthroughs surrounding Christie's case became part of a larger shift in criminal investigations. Across the United States, law enforcement agencies began looking differently at old evidence. Files that had spent decades untouched were reopened. Evidence that once seemed limited was reevaluated. Investigators began asking new questions about what information could be extracted from material collected years earlier. The lesson was clear. An old case does not necessarily mean an impossible case. Technology had changed the timeline of justice. A crime committed in one era could be solved in another. The investigators who worked on Christie's case became part of a growing movement that recognized the value of combining traditional police work with modern forensic science. The foundation remained the same. The scene had to be properly examined. Evidence had to be collected carefully. Reports had to be accurate. Witness information had to be documented. But now, those traditional methods could be enhanced by tools that earlier investigators never had. Genetic genealogy represented one of the most significant changes in that process. It created a bridge between unidentified DNA evidence and real-world identities. However, the science was not magic. It required detailed research. It required careful interpretation. It required investigators to follow a complicated path from genetic relationships to possible individuals. A DNA connection alone did not solve the crime. It created a direction. Investigators still needed to confirm the information through additional evidence and establish a case strong enough to survive legal examination. That careful approach was essential. The justice system cannot operate on possibilities. It requires proof. The prosecution's case against Raymond D.J. Rowe depended on that principle. The DNA evidence became the central element, but the significance of that evidence came from the complete investigation surrounding it. The scientific findings were connected to the original crime scene. The timeline was examined. The circumstances of the case were reviewed. The evidence was presented through a process designed to determine the truth. That process also brought renewed attention to the importance of victims in criminal cases. When a murder investigation lasts decades, public discussion can sometimes focus heavily on the person responsible. The suspect becomes the subject of headlines. The investigation becomes a story about solving a mystery. But every case begins with someone who is lost. Christy Merrick's story began long before the crime. She was a young woman starting her career. She was an educator who cared about children. She was someone with plans, relationships, and dreams. Her death created an absence that could not be measured only through police reports or courtroom documents. The people who knew her carried memories that continued long after the investigation became a national example of forensic progress. Those memories were an important reminder that victims should never become secondary characters in their own stories. The technology solved the case. But the reason the case mattered was Christie's life. The investigation also highlighted another important reality about cold cases. Solving them requires commitment from communities as well as law enforcement. Public information can remain valuable even years later. A conversation that seems insignificant at the time may eventually become important. A person who remembers a small detail may provide the missing piece. Cold cases often survive because someone continues to care. In Christie's case, that commitment existed through decades of uncertainty. Her family continued seeking answers. Investigators continued reviewing possibilities. The evidence remained preserved. The case remained active. That persistence created the opportunity for justice when science finally provided the necessary tools. The resolution also offered hope to families connected to other unsolved crimes. For years, many relatives believed their cases might never move forward. They watched time pass while the person responsible remained unidentified. The success of cases like Christie's changed that perception. It showed that unanswered does not mean forgotten. It showed that evidence can remain meaningful even after decades. It showed that investigators can return to old cases with new possibilities. But it also revealed the emotional complexity of finally receiving answers. For families of homicide victims, closure is often more complicated than a single word suggests. A conviction can provide accountability. It can confirm what happened. It can end uncertainty. But it cannot restore the person who was lost. The years that passed cannot be recovered. The future that was taken cannot be recreated. Justice acknowledges the harm. It does not erase it. That reality remained at the center of Christie's story. The case became famous because of the science that solved it. But the reason people continued caring was because of the person behind the investigation. A teacher.
A daughter.
A friend. A member of a community who deserved to live a full life. The legacy of the case therefore existed in two places. One was in the world of forensic science. The other was in the memories of those who knew Christie. The first showed what technology could accomplish. The second showed why the search mattered. Years after the crime, the evidence from that December morning finally revealed the truth. The mystery that had remained unanswered for generations was no longer a mystery. The unknown DNA profile had a name. The investigation had reached its conclusion. But the larger message continued. Cold cases are not only about the past. They are about the possibility of the future. They are about preserving evidence today because tomorrow's science may uncover what today cannot. They are about refusing to accept that time has the final word. The story of Christie Merrick's murder became one of those rare cases where the past returned to demand attention. A forgotten piece of evidence became a voice. A decades-old investigation became active again. A family's unanswered questions finally received answers. And a community that had carried the memory of a young teacher's death for years finally saw justice delivered. But even after justice arrived, one truth remained unchanged. The most important part of Christie Merrick's story was never only how her killer was found. It was that she was remembered. The final chapter of the Christie Merrick case was not written only in a courtroom. It was written across decades of unanswered questions, years of investigative work, and a relentless search for truth that refused to disappear. For nearly a quarter of a century, the murder of a young teacher remained one of Lancaster County's most painful mysteries. The case began with a shocking discovery inside a quiet apartment and continued through years of uncertainty, speculation, and unanswered questions. But the story did not end with silence. It ended with evidence. It ended with science. And it ended with a name. The journey from an unsolved homicide to a solved case represented one of the most significant transformations in modern criminal investigation. The evidence collected in 1992 had survived through time, waiting for technology to advance enough to reveal what investigators had always hoped to find. The truth had never disappeared. It had only been hidden. The case demonstrated a powerful reality about forensic investigations. Sometimes justice does not arrive quickly, but that does not mean it will never arrive. For Christie Merrick's family, the years between tragedy and resolution were filled with uncertainty that few people could fully understand. They lived with the knowledge that the person responsible had not been identified. They carried memories of Christie while waiting for answers that seemed increasingly distant with every passing year. Yet the search continued. That persistence became one of the defining elements of the case. Investigators did not allow the passage of time to erase the importance of what happened. The file remained active. The evidence remained preserved. The possibility of solving the case remained alive. Then came the moment when decades of investigation connected with a new era of science. Genetic genealogy changed the direction of the case. The unknown DNA profile recovered from the crime scene was no longer simply an unidentified piece of evidence. Through advanced analysis, it became a pathway toward identifying the person responsible. The method represented a dramatic change in how investigators approached cold cases. For years, detectives searched for direct connections. Now, they could search through genetic relationships. The approach opened possibilities that had not existed when Christie was killed. It allowed investigators to explore connections across generations and use those relationships to guide the investigation toward a potential suspect. That breakthrough did not replace traditional police work. It strengthened it. The original evidence mattered. The original investigation mattered. The work performed decades earlier mattered. The final result was built on the foundation created from the beginning. The identification of Raymond D.J. Rowe brought an end to one of Pennsylvania's longest-running mysteries. The arrest and conviction provided the accountability that investigators and Christie's family had waited years to see. But the conclusion of the legal process did not erase the tragedy. A solved case is not the same as an undone loss. A conviction cannot return a person to their family. It cannot restore missed moments. It cannot give back the future that was taken away. What it can do is establish the truth. It can recognize the victim. It can hold the responsible person accountable. And it can provide an answer to a question that has haunted families for years. For the community that remembered Christie, the most important legacy of the case was not only the technology that solved it. It was the reminder of who she was. Before she became part of a criminal investigation, Christie Myrick was a teacher who dedicated herself to her students. She was someone building a future and creating connections with the people around her. Her life was defined by more than the tragedy that ended it. That distinction became an important part of remembering her. The headlines focused on the crime. The investigation focused on evidence. The courtroom focused on responsibility. But the people who knew Christie remembered a person. That memory remained the strongest connection to the life that existed before December 1992. The case also left a lasting impact on the world of criminal justice. It became an example of how technological advancement could transform investigations once believed impossible to solve. It encouraged law enforcement agencies to reconsider old cases. It inspired renewed examination of preserved evidence. It gave hope to families who had spent years waiting for answers. Across the country, other cold cases began receiving renewed attention as investigators explored whether similar scientific methods could provide new leads. The message was clear. Time does not always protect the guilty. Sometimes, time allows the truth to catch up. The person responsible for Christie's murder lived for years without being identified. The investigation appeared stalled. The evidence appeared silent. But silence is not the same as disappearance. The evidence remained. The investigation remained. The possibility of justice remained. And eventually the past spoke. The story of Christie Myrick's murder is ultimately a story about persistence. It is a story about investigators who continued searching. It is a story about scientists who developed new tools. It is a story about a family that waited for answers. And it is a story about a young woman whose life mattered. The case began with a devastating loss. It continued through years of uncertainty. It reached a breakthrough through science. And it ended with accountability. But the final memory left behind is not only about the person convicted. It is about the person remembered. Christie Myrick was a teacher. She was a daughter. She was a friend. She was a person whose life touched others. The crime that ended her life became a major investigation, but it was never the complete story of who she was. The complete story existed in the memories of those who knew her and the lives she influenced. That is the lasting lesson of the case. Behind every cold case is not just evidence. Behind every investigation is not just a mystery. Behind every file is a person. And behind every search for justice is the hope that one day, the truth will finally be found. For Christy Myrick, that day came decades after the crime that shocked her community. The unanswered question finally had an answer. The evidence finally had a voice. And after years of waiting, justice finally arrived. The story of Christy Myrick's murder did not end when the courtroom reached its decision. In many ways, that moment marked the beginning of another chapter, one focused not on the search for a killer, but on understanding the lasting impact of a case that changed how investigators approach the darkest mysteries of the past. For decades, the questions surrounding Christy's death had remained unanswered. A young teacher had been taken from her family and her students. An investigation had begun with urgency. Evidence had been collected. Leads had been followed. But the person responsible remained unidentified for years. Then, after nearly a quarter of a century, a combination of preserved evidence and advancing science changed everything. The case became a reminder that investigations do not always follow a straight path. Some move quickly. Others require patience measured not in days or months, but in decades. The investigation into Christy Myrick's murder belonged to the second category. It was a case shaped by time. Time that created distance. Time that changed technology. Time that allowed new methods to emerge. And ultimately, time that helped reveal the truth. The importance of the case reached beyond Lancaster County because it represented a major moment in the evolution of forensic investigation. It showed that evidence collected during an earlier era could still have enormous value when examined with modern tools. For investigators working cold cases, this principle became increasingly important. Every piece of evidence matters. Every record matters. Every detail preserved from the beginning can become significant later. The science available on the day of a crime may not be the science available years afterward. That reality changed the way law enforcement agencies approached unsolved cases. Instead of viewing old evidence as something connected only to the past, investigators began seeing it as a resource for future discoveries. Christy's case became one example of that transformation. The DNA evidence that existed in 1992 could not immediately provide an identity. But decades later, it provided the connection needed to move the investigation forward. The breakthrough also highlighted the importance of cooperation between different fields. Detectives brought investigative experience. Laboratories brought scientific analysis. Researchers brought expertise in genetic connections. Prosecutors brought the evidence into the legal system. Each part of the process was necessary. The final answer came not from one discovery alone, but from the combination of many efforts over many years. For the public, the case represented something both hopeful and unsettling. Hopeful because it showed that unresolved cases can still be solved. Unsettling because it revealed how long a person responsible for a violent crime could remain unidentified. The passage of time had allowed life to continue around the tragedy. Communities changed. Technology changed.
People changed.
But the impact of the crime remained. For Christy's family, the years did not lessen the importance of finding answers. The investigation was never just about solving a mystery. It was about acknowledging the loss of someone who mattered. That is often the emotional reality behind cold cases. The public may see a headline. Investigators may see a file. Courts may see evidence. But families see a person. They remember birthdays, conversations, shared moments, dreams that were never completed. Those memories exist separately from the investigation, and they continue long after legal proceedings conclude. Christy's legacy was therefore not defined only by the circumstances of her death. It was also defined by the life she lived before that moment. She was remembered as an educator who cared about her students and believed in the importance of teaching. Her work represented a commitment to helping young people learn and grow. That part of her story remained important because it reminded people that victims of crime are never only victims. They are individuals with histories, relationships, and identities beyond the events that made them known to the public. The investigation also became part of a broader discussion about the future of criminal justice. As DNA technology continued advancing, more agencies began reviewing older cases. Evidence that had once reached a dead end was being reconsidered. But every new method came with responsibility. Scientific tools must be used carefully. Evidence must be interpreted accurately. Legal standards must continue to protect fairness. The power of technology depends on the discipline and care of the people using it. The Christy Myrick case demonstrated both sides of this reality. It showed what modern science could accomplish. And it showed why careful investigation remained essential. Years after the crime, the case became more than a story about solving a murder. It became a story about persistence. About refusing to accept that unanswered questions must remain unanswered forever. About believing that evidence can survive even when memories fade. About understanding that justice sometimes requires patience. The investigation had crossed generations. The people who first searched for answers in 1992 could not have imagined the tools that would eventually solve the case. But their work created the foundation for those future discoveries. The evidence they preserved became the bridge between two different eras of investigation. The past provided the clues. The future provided the ability to understand them. Together, they revealed the truth. And that may be the most lasting lesson of Christy Myrick's case. A cold case is never only about the years that have passed. It is about the possibility that answers still exist. It is about the responsibility to preserve evidence. It is about the determination to continue searching. Because behind every unsolved case is a family waiting. Behind every piece of evidence is a story. And behind every investigation is the hope that one day, the truth will no longer remain hidden. For Christy Myrick, that truth finally emerged. The mystery that had followed her name for decades was resolved. But the memory of who she was continues to remain the most important part of the story. Not the years of uncertainty. Not only the investigation. Not only the courtroom. But the life of a young teacher whose story continues to remind the world that justice is not only about finding the person responsible. It is also about remembering the person who was lost.